You're not going to convince white people to change. That's not going to be the way that this happens. You have to deal with the actual problem, which is the political and economic system, and you can do that without white. Like you can have a revolution without white people.
Welcome back to The Tea, the show where we dive into the stories behind the headlines. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Here in the centres of empire, we were long sold the notion of progress toward an egalitarian ideal. But in practice, things aren't getting better for everyone, and they are absolutely getting worse for some. In the midst of widening inequality, it should surprise no one to see the rise of parties pandering to racist voters, desperate to find someone to blame other than themselves, aka the millionaire and billionaire tax avoiders running the country. And with it, weirdly impassioned debates about woke having gone too far and political correctness gone mad have blossomed. In other words, a nostalgia for a time when white men could speak even more freely about why they're so superior to everyone else. With the return of what some view as an open white supremacist to the White House, but also a growing confidence and pushback from global South nations, racism and race are front and center in the struggle over the very future of our societies. To help us try and make sense of this juncture, I'm joined today by a towering figure in Black studies and author of several books, including the groundbreaking The New Age of Empire, Professor Kehinde Andrews. As the UK's first Black studies professor and a fierce critic of what he calls the psychosis of whiteness, he brings his razor-sharp analysis to bear on the latest flashpoints in our ever-evolving racial landscape. Before we get into it, can I ask you to do one thing and to support the show, and that is to hit that subscribe button now and sign up to our Patreon. Details are in the caption below. Thank you. Kehinde, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you for having me on.
Really appreciate your presence at this complicated, difficult, what's the word we should be using on this one?
Exciting, okay.
We'll delve into why you think it's an exciting time. You've authored a book called White Psychosis. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what white psychosis is, and are we in the grips of it?
Well, yeah, the psychosis of whiteness is the delusions, right? So if you think about we live in an economy where children die every day. A child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. We have our mobile devices. We need young kids in the Congo to go into mines to take them out. And the world is no more equal today than it was 200 years ago, but we have to pretend that it is. So the psychosis of whiteness is all of these delusions to make us think that the blood on our hands is actually the sweat from our hard work, that we deserve all these privileges that we have in the West. So it's just a set of ideas which really keep us going down this terrible, terrible path.
And how are those ideas sustained? Like how have we all come to believe in the psychosis of whiteness? Like what's the infrastructure to keep us like maintained within that belief?
The idea for the psychosis came from me watching movies about slavery. In the UK, there's been 2 movies made about slavery. Belle, which was about the only black woman who was raised in a mansion house because her father was a lord and her mother was an enslaved African, and it's this whole like fantasy tale, this Jane Austen drama of the 18th century, and you watch it and you go, what's happening? How is this the story? And the other one was about William Wilberforce, the white guy who ended slavery apparently. And those are the 2 movies, and I'm watching these movies going, this is psychotic, right? This is actually, psychosis has 2 elements. One is delusional thinking, but 2 is that you have to have these hallucinations. And the media actually give you these hallucinations, which reinforce all these terrible ideas that we get in schools, that we get in home, that we get everywhere.
Happy Black History Month?
Well, don't get me started on Black History Month, because that in itself could be one of the main problems.
There's a lot of pushback, obviously, at the moment against this idea that actually diversity's gone too far, right? We needed it 50 years ago, but today, the argument goes that black people are overrepresented on screen, that minorities have all of these schemes to support them, and that actually the people who are falling behind, even in terms of things like education, are white men or white boys. Yeah. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, that's a perfect example of psychosis, right? Like, it's utterly untrue. There is no evidence. Have you been to media? I mean, as somebody who works in media, who works in universities, you go in all the top jobs, there's so few of us, it's crazy, dominated by white men. But you have these attempts to try and address that, and they haven't worked. So DEI, EDI, whatever you want to call it, it's mostly performative, doesn't do anything. But that then becomes this bogeyman. Oh, look, we're the real ones falling behind. With all the evidence will tell you that it's simply not true. These delusional ideas are what we need to keep everything going, right?
What would you reply to the people who say, well, they're actually you're overrepresented in these spheres?
Well, you can be overrepresented, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's positive, right? So, for example, take the media, overrepresented on screen, yes. Behind the screen, no. Production companies, no. Telling the stories, not at all. It's kind of like football, where there's loads of black footballers, but who actually has the power in football? It's not the people on the pitch. So even though, yes, there's more of us on screen, it does not mean that we're benefiting. Also, people in cities are overrepresented. London's overrepresented. And actually, when you take that into account, we're probably underrepresented on screen because in the cities, we're massively overrepresented. So again, it's easy to look at it and say, look, you see a lot of black people, black faces. Yeah. But actually, black faces doesn't mean we've made any progress. I think and even in politics, media, the black faces does not mean we've changed. And actually, if you look at the fundamental underlying things, they're still exactly the same.
And what would your measure of positive change be? Like, how would you assess it? Because clearly the assessment measures that are being used are skewed. You refer to, for example, the fact that if you look behind the scenes in TV, it's very different to the picture that we are painting in our ads, which is, I guess part of something that Riz Ahmed had talked about years ago when it comes to America. America exports this really like multicultural, multiracial dream to the rest of the world, right? The meritocratic, multiracial dream. And in reality, the society is completely different to that. And so the sort of Hollywood serves as to buttress this notion of an egalitarian society, which is at odds with the reality. Do we have a version of that here, would you say, in the UK?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, what's happened is you have token changes, symbolic changes. So yeah, America's like perfect at this, where you'll see lots of diversity on screen, but not behind the cameras, not in terms of the stories that get told. And in the UK, we're starting to see the same thing, right? So you'll get diversity, performative diversity. We had a brown prime minister, right? Prime minister of the most racist government probably ever in the UK, but certainly in my lifetime. And so it sells you this dream, and that dream, that's the psychosis, because we need that, right? We need those delusions to think that we've gone too far. We now think we've gone too far, right? So we're actually not addressing any of the actual problems, which are about wealth inequality, which are about life. Like, for example, if I was going to say one thing we should actually focus on, would be life expectancy, and not just in the UK. So what we tend to do is we just look at the UK and say, well, look, how are we doing in the UK? Which is one measure, but actually look how we're doing globally. It's horrendous. The life expectancy in Nigeria, which has like a fifth of the continent of Africa, is 54 years old. Like, wow. It's horrendous. You are far more, if you're black, you're so more likely to die earlier, even in the UK and in America too. Close that gap. Let's close the life expectancy gap. That will be a start. And to do that, though, then you have to say, well, actually, let's look at these big economic issues. Let's look at structural inequality. And those are just not the questions that we're having.
How would you interpret Trump's re-election, particularly after what we saw, right? Which is that I think a lot of people, after what happened on the 6th of January insurrection, there was a recognition that white supremacists were literally on the doorstep, and in some cases actually in the White House. Yeah. And yet here we are.
I actually thought he would get re-elected, but that's because of the psychosis. The idea that this man who's totally incapable, incredible, because now becomes president again, a convicted felon, you just list it all up. That's what I'm telling you. That's the delusions. You can look past all of that and still say this should be the person that leads the country. This should be the leader of the free world. There's probably no better example of the impact of the psychosis than Trump.
And how do you sense that he's succeeded in doing that? Because on one hand, he'll make claims like he supports a quote unquote colorblind and merit-based society because, and again I quote, whether you are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots. I mean, is he selling his own version of an egalitarian dream?
Yeah, I mean, that is the dream, right? That was Martin Luther King. I have a dream that my kids can play with white kids, and that's what it gets reduced to, which has become such a big part of America's more broad psychosis around race. Is it actually Martin Luther King's used by the right wing, used by Trump? In fact, at Trump's inauguration, they had the black pastor cooning up the place with his telling of the "I Have a Dream" speech. I mean, it really is selling this dream, but it is a dream, right? It is completely and utterly delusional. But it's the reason that Trump and the right more generally win is because they understand Psychosis, it doesn't need evidence, doesn't need facts. It's about feel, it's about emotion. And the left spends far too much time saying, well, look, this is going to be bad for your pocketbook, this is economic issues. These are all the rational reasons you shouldn't do this. But the right, no, Trump knows, he don't care. He just lies, he says what you want to hear. And it just says what you want to hear, soothes you, and that's how you win.
And now we also have removed all the fact checking on the platforms where most people are absorbing their information, so that despite the fact that Trump is continuously caught actually spreading lies on social media, a lot of people will not even now know that those are lies, because we are now living in a post-truth world.
Yeah, but they don't care. That's the thing. Honestly, the fact checking don't matter. They don't care. You can tell somebody it's a lie, they will not care.
But why? Why don't they care?
Because again, it's psychosis. This is why I wrote the book about psychosis, because we rightly think that these things should matter, right? It should matter the evidence. It should matter it should matter, right? It should. But when you're dealing with someone in a psychosis, you wouldn't. If someone was had a psychotic episode, you wouldn't try to reason with them, right? You wouldn't try to explain to them rationally what's going on. You'd understand that would be a dead end. And this is exactly how we have to treat this issue. You're not going to be able to. You can't reason with whiteness. We've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. It just gets us killed. Right, so we have to actually treat the disease, and the disease is the system, the economic base, the political order. That's the disease, and we spend far too much time driving ourselves mad in these totally and utterly irrational conversations. Right?
Yeah, and I hear that, because I think obviously over the last 16 months we've engaged with kind of the very, very violent face of whiteness in its military form in the Middle East, and there is absolutely no reasoning with any of the kind of traditional markers, whether it's international law, human rights, global consensus, democratic majority. None of it actually matters. Because there is, a policy behind all of that is more weighty than anything that we kind of have held up as these ideals. And I suppose that's partly why there is a sense that we are at a period of like a crumbling old order, but the new order that people are trying to forge looks pretty scary to a lot of people. Here in the UK, just a poll recently shows that if voters went to the polls today, Reform UK would win the elections. They have a majority of votes today. And I just want to remind our international viewers who Reform UK are. So it's a party formed by Nigel Farage, who is on the far right of the right by any standards. A number of their candidates during the elections were outed and caught on camera making racist, Islamophobic, homophobic comments. The party has kind of been mired in this reputation for a racist outlook. The other interesting and concerning thing is that they are doing exceptionally well on TikTok. So they have over 3.8 million followers on TikTok. They're doing much better than any other party, with young men in particular. And so I wanted to ask you about what this rise of like Reform UK means for, everyone, but I guess particularly minoritized communities. And is it the same implications for everyone, would you say?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is, again, just a perfect example of the evidence doesn't matter, right? Like Farage was the one who was pro-Brexit, let's Brexit, and we know that Brexit was bad. Like we can feel it. We can actually economically feel it in our pockets. But yeah, still he's wildly popular. And a prediction I'll give you is he will eventually be Prime Minister.
Oh, God, no.
100% no, he's coming.
No.
It's 100% coming.
Really?
Kemi Badenoch makes a deal with Reform. They win the election. He gets rid of her. She's Prime Minister. He's Prime Minister. That's what. I promise you. This is going to happen. Give it 5 years. Give it next election cycle. Eventually, Farage is going to be Prime Minister. If Trump could be president, if Trump could be president, why would we even be surprised?
I mean, I suppose you're right, and we shouldn't be. But I guess on one hand, and I suppose this applies just as much to Trump. But I look at someone like Nigel Farage, who is an elite. He's a millionaire. He's from public. Public in the UK, by the way, guys, means private anywhere else in the world. But basically, he's from a wealthy background, and yet he's out here speaking like he's for the common man, and he's the representative of this like white working class underclass that isn't heard anywhere else. It's baffling, Kehinde. I don't get it.
Trump's perfectly exactly right. A rich man speaks to the common person. It's psychosis. Again, mediocre white men. Mediocre white men is a feature of history. I mean, honestly, a feature of history. And someone like Farage, the fact he can do it, we shouldn't be surprised. And the fact he'll use it all the way to get to Prime Minister, I would not be surprised at all. That's where we're headed. Unless the left starts to deal with emotion, right? You can't deal with someone like Farage with facts. Brexit should have told us that facts don't work. Facts are totally and utterly irrelevant. It's all about emotion. And what they've done really well in both sides of the Atlantic is they blame us, they blame immigrants for their cause. I mean, Farage, the big thing, Farage is, if you're going to say what class is the most culpable for the fact that nothing works in the country and it just is run down, you haven't got jobs, it's his class, right? It's his class that takes all the wealth.
Yeah.
Like tax dodges, etc. That's the problem. But they've turned that and blamed it on us. There's too many of us. There's too many immigrants. And people are lapping that up. And unfortunately, we're lapping that up too, right? We're Black British now. We don't care about migrants crossing the Atlantic, crossing the Mediterranean. We want to keep them out as well. You've seen that's been a big thing you've seen in America, which again, Trump getting elected by a majority of Latinos. People are, how can that be the case?
Yes.
They think they're American. They don't think they're Latino. And we have this very similar problem here in Britain where we think we're British. And then because of that, we act like British. And what do the Brits do? Pull up the borders, keep it for ourselves, etc. So you'll find far more support for things like reform and the right from Black and brown communities than there definitely should be.
So you're an advocate for transnational identities. And what would you identify as being the issue with Black British identity? I mean, you've hinted obviously at some of it now, but there is obviously a growing interest in this notion of Black British identity. And what does it mean to you?
Britain is the enslaving nation, right? Britain, I'm in Britain because some British people went to West Africa, took my ancestors to the Caribbean, enslaved them for hundreds of years, then colonized them, and then we had to move over here because we were poor, right? Because Jamaica's a colony. The idea that I would want to feel identified with this terrible country that's done this to not just to me, but to large parts of the world, the largest empire that ever existed, that has impoverished the world to the point that a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. Britain is not good, right? You can make a case, yes, we are just as everything my family's done has been just as important to building up Britain, but I'm actually not proud of that, because what Britain is a colonial, wicked nation state. So why would I want to identify with it? I'm in Britain, but I'm not British. I'm just here. I'm not here because I want to be here, because this is we got kidnapped.
Would you advocate for forms of solidarity based on any things other than the nation state? Because of course, I think we also forget that the nation state is a relatively new invention, right? I mean, particularly for some parts of the world, it was a relatively new external imposition. Is your perspective grounded in like a connection to the nation state just not being any sort of basis for solidarity at all?
This is not just a Britain argument, by the way. I'd say the same. Jamaicans don't like it, but I say the same thing. Jamaica is a prison colony. Well, when my dad talks about going back home, what kind of home is that? It's a home you were literally taken to in chains and has impoverished you ever since. On the African continent, all these countries are made up. Nigeria, Ghana, they drew it on a map to control and contain you. The worst thing you can do is identify with whichever nation state you are in. The nation state that we have, you can directly tie a line to Western imperialism and how to control us. I'm black. That means I connect to Africa. My connection is to Africa and the African descent. That's I'm black and I'm in Britain. I'll never ever call me British, because that is not something I'll ever adopt.
And it's interesting because you're saying that at a time where I feel like there's such a push to, on one hand, we're going through some of the most overtly racist discourse I think I've seen in my lifetime in the public arena. I think there are things that are said publicly now that like even when I was a kid, when there would have been more racism on the streets, people were a bit more shy to say those things publicly. They're things that are said much more openly now. And at the same time, we have someone like Kemi Badenoch, who's elected to the head of the Conservative Party in this country. And that is seen as a huge measure of success for the country, but also for Black Britishness. So what do you say to, people like Kemi and others who say, well, no, look, this is progress, this is advancement? It's
regression. It's definitely not progress. I mean, I predicted before Kemi Badenoch will be the first Black Prime Minister, and no Black people will be happy about it. Like, so if we're all mad, we're all going, oh my God, that's terrible. That can't be good for Black Britain, or whatever that means, right? And I think one of the things that has changed to some extent, because it was always the case, like, we do forget the British Empire couldn't have run without collaborators. Like, most of the people in India the administrative level would have been Indian. Same in African countries. You have the chiefs, etc. Like there's always been collaborators, right? The difference now is because we're here, you can actually get to the top, right? You can be Obama, you can be Kemi, you can have black faces in those places. But if we think that changes the nature of what the role is. Like the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of the United States, those are white supremacist roles. That's what they are. So you can be in the role. It doesn't matter what color. You could be green. It doesn't matter what color you are. You're still going to be white supremacist, right? And so what's actually happened with the right, and the right have understood this, they've said, well, let's get in these elected officials. Let's put people in these highest places possible, carry on doing racist policies, but we can pretend we're not racist. And that's what they'll do. If Kemi Badenoch becomes Prime Minister, I guarantee it will also be the most racist administration. They will be able to get away with things they couldn't possibly get away with a white Prime Minister. In fact, if you look at the immigration legislation that's been passed in the last few years under the Tories, deportation flights, Windrush scandal, putting people in the barge, Rwanda, honestly, it's madness. It's not a coincidence that it was Asian Home Secretary. When the last Asian Home Secretary left, they had to move the black one cleverly from Foreign Secretary to Home Secretary, so they had cover for their racist policy. It actually gets more racist when you have black and brown people in those positions. So this is not progress. It's the opposite.
Well, speaking of progress, I feel like we've always been sold this notion that at least in Western societies, that history is just a inevitable progress towards, a betterment for everyone, right? And I don't want to sound like I've drunk the Kool-Aid, but I do think that each generation's been sold this notion that it's just always getting better. We're getting healthier, we're living longer, life is better, and I guess for some people, that is the case. Yeah. But we're also living at a time where there's huge inequality and growing inequality. So do you think we're also seeing this dismantling of this paradigm of the progress narrative? And without that, what direction are we headed in? Because we all believed it was getting better. If we're going to put that aside now, where are we heading? Better, worse? Stagnation, different directions for different groups?
So I think there's two delusions happening at the same time. So one of those is actually true. So it actually is true that over the last 300 years, for some people, white people in the West, things have been getting better, like significantly better, right? Yeah. And that's because of genocide, slavery, and colonialism. They built this economy that has pulled people up in Britain and the West into unparalleled levels of success, wealth, technological advancement, etc., etc., etc. For most people in the world, actually not got better at all. So if you look at so-called sub-Saharan Africa, it'd be very hard to argue it's better now than it was before. There's some people doing very well, but most people are doing very, 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 very badly. Talk about economics, talk about food security, talk about and future as well. It looks even bleaker, right? So in the West, it's got better. What's happened now for us, and this is the problem for us, a really big problem that we have, is that when my family came over here, we weren't really in. We were just here, but we weren't in the West, right? There was no racial legislation. There wasn't civil rights bills in America. There wasn't independence in the Caribbean. And so we were really out of it. So we were still in what Malcolm X would call the field. But the change that's happened over the last 60 years is we're now in it. I'm a professor. Like, it would be ridiculous for me how can I criticize Britain and not criticize myself? I have my wealth because black kids die. So I'm culpable now. I'm in it, right? And so we're now in the house, and we're now also benefiting, and then actually still ignoring the fact that most people aren't benefiting. And I think all we're seeing at the moment is that within the West, there's some people have taken it too far, right? The elite have captured all the money, and there does need to be a reset. And I think what you'll probably see is eventually there'll be a reset where you get more like social democracy, you get more sharing of the wealth within the West. Not outside the West, though. The rest of the world needs to be poor. And they're not going to be benefit all of this, right? So we're actually going to end up with a political moment where we'll probably over here do better in the long run, but the rest of the world will still be just as poor as they ever were, because you have to have that poverty to produce the wealth that we're fighting over.
That was going to be my next question. So is the wealth of Western nations predicated on the exploitation and poverty of the global south, is there a version of the story in which wealth is redistributed more equally and everyone benefits? Or are we saying this is like an inherent feature of the system?
It's always been the feature of the system, right? So you needed slavery in order to produce the wealth that produced the working class. So we talk about the working class, and that's only possible because of the wealth that came from slavery. And that allowed capital industrial progress, factories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Once people in the West got to a level where they didn't want to do factory work, what did they do? They exploited it, right? So now it takes place in the underdeveloped world. So there's two areas in terms of look at the wages they pay the workers in the factories overseas. Could never have those here, right? Never have those here. But you need those wages in order to make commodity prices work. And on the African continent, it's predominantly about resource extraction, right? So we're taking cobalt, all the minerals, etc. Imagine that capitalism would collapse immediately if you had to pay a decent wage to people in Asia and it had to pay decent prices for commodities in Africa.
Yeah.
Completely collapse.
Yeah.
So you need to have that poverty for us to have our wealth.
I guess that's part of the bind that we're all kept in, like this devil's pact, where it's like none of us want to give up the comforts of the life that we've built, albeit it's largely crumbs for many people compared to what the majority are getting. But it's still better crumbs than nothing on the table at all, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I guess the question around that is there a model of liberation that is able to encompass the dignity of all peoples? Or is there always a situation of winners and losers?
No, I mean, I think we have to believe that there is possible to have much more equality, but you cannot have it in this system. To quote Malcolm again, because I just quote Malcolm X all the time, but he says, look, this system can no more provide freedom, justice, and equality for black people than a chicken can lay a duck egg, right? It's not meant to do it, right? So if we think we can edit this system, which has always been based on our oppression, to somehow be equal, it's not the case. We have to get rid of the whole thing and rebuild. And that is going to mean losing things. We're not going to be as comfortable. You could create a world where everybody is comfortable. That world probably won't have all the highs, all those massive highs of the rich. But those are the things that we want, right?
Yeah.
And my kids telling me, oh, Daddy, I want to be a billionaire.
Yeah.
I was like, no, you don't. That's banned in my house.
Yes.
You don't want to be a billionaire.
Yeah.
You don't need billionaires or billionaires. It's that world is a different world. We need to build a world where actually we're saying, how do we all eat? How do we all function? How are we all comfortable and happy? But that's a completely different world to the one we have in there.
Good luck on selling that on Instagram is all I'm going to say, because I also have been privy to the rise of the pro-billionaire content, which I have to believe the deepest recesses of my conspiracy self believe is very much intended to kind of buttress this notion of like, well, anyone could technically be a billionaire, which of course we know is even less likely than the previous myth of everybody could be a millionaire.
Yeah.
The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button now and join us on Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. I want to talk to you about the DEI schemes, which obviously President Trump, one of the first things he did was to cancel these DEI policies. Many people are bemoaning that. Amnesty International has written about this as kind of white supremacist policies that Trump has brought about, using explicitly those terms, white supremacist. But I also know that a lot of people are very skeptical of DEI. I know you are. I am quite skeptical myself. Is the loss of these schemes a loss?
No. I mean, just be blunt. It's not. I can't sit here and tell you that it's not. I mean, it is some big loss. They don't do anything, right? DEI, equality, diversity is mostly pointless. Companies spend thousands of pounds on nonsense.
Okay, let me put the counter just for balance here. So somebody would say, well, DEI allows candidates who would otherwise be overlooked to be considered for roles that they wouldn't otherwise be considered for. Is it not a loss that there are very talented black and brown candidates, female candidates, disabled candidates who will no longer be put forward in certain roles, who will be overlooked for certain roles because these DEI schemes are no longer there?
So in the UK, it's certainly not the case that there's any real that ever really happens. So affirmative action here is not really a thing, right? They put on a flyer, black people please apply, and then you don't get the job, right? Even in the United States, I think it's heavily overestimated how many people actually got their job because of affirmative action. It's not that many, right? People get the job because they're good at their jobs, largely, and actually people don't get the jobs because things racist, right? So you can have policies. The NFL is a good example of the Rooney Rule. So you have to interview 2 black candidates for every head coaching job.
Okay.
They just interview the 2 black candidates and then hire the white candidate, right? So it doesn't work anyway. So I doubt there's much good evidence to suggest that removing DEI policies will actually lead to people getting jobs. Then there's a second thing of who actually gets the jobs anyway. DEI, in terms of that concrete people getting jobs, they have this any black will do. Right, so does any old black person, not even black, you can just be a bit of color, come in and get the job, and that's fine. And then the idea that that's what success is, that we measure success by the fact there's a few black people, and it's only going to be a handful of black people who get these jobs anyway, that doesn't mean success, right? In America, has a much bigger middle class than Britain, has much more black elected officials than Britain, and is much more obviously structurally racist than Britain at the same time, right? So even if it does lead to a few less job people being hired, I'm not sure that shouldn't be the goal anyway. And broadly speaking, when you think about what's being cancelled, it is these initiatives that it's just I know for a fact because I make this money, right? So February comes along now. Usually America, I'm getting invites. Can you come and do a talk? We'll give you some money. I'm always feeling a bit guilty. You don't do nothing. And it's just that there's an industry that don't make no difference. Like, it's not really the end of the world. I'll be honest. I'm not saying I support Trump on this because Trump, the reason he's doing it is clearly racist. And one of the negative impacts will be that black people will lose jobs, and predominantly black women are going to lose jobs. So that is a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is something we should be praising. But I think that if we actually think something's been lost, that shows us that we don't understand what the problem was in the first place.
And I mean, you've also been critical generally of, I mean, you mentioned they're going to give these talks, these DI talks. I've done I know exactly the circuit that you're talking about. We have our own version of that in the Muslim sector. And I wanted to ask you about the notion that talking about race is helpful, because I think you've previously said that you think talking about race is not helpful. And I wanted to ask you about that because, well, apart from anything else, I did have a podcast called We Need to Talk About Whiteness. So why do you think it's unhelpful to talk about race?
So it can be helpful, don't get me wrong. If you're having a productive conversation, it can be helpful.
Yeah.
But I think what 2020 showed us is, George Floyd happens, it's a massive conversation about race.
Yeah.
For a moment, it seemed productive. Actually, it did seem like there were different conversations. But then what happened very, very quickly was backlash.
Right.
It's massive backlash. And in fact, without that backlash, I strongly doubt Trump gets elected. If 2020 doesn't happen, it's just we just carry on normally, we'd have remembered that Trump was, we'd have remembered everything with the Capitol, we'd have remembered everything. Capitol, remembered COVID stuff. We remembered all that stuff. But he basically gets elected on the resentment wave that comes back because we all started talking about race. Right? The KKK love talking about race all the time. And I think you've seen the same thing in Britain. We're having this conversation about race, which is heavily unproductive, and it's actually taking us in a completely opposite direction. And that's the problem.
So it's interesting because I do think that the way that we talk about race, despite there being so many conversations about race, does seem to be really unproductive. And I guess one of the ways that seems obvious to me, and it applies in debates, and again, debates is the issue, on things like Islamophobia, right? Yeah. So people are not encouraged to come on TV and to talk about their experiences so other people could learn about maybe an experience or worldview that they're not familiar with, but more so to debate the veracity or accuracy of that experience, which surely is only as true as the person who's experiencing it tells you it is. And so I was wondering to that extent whether the issue is that we continue to look at racism as a debate.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem, right? So interestingly, I much more prefer going on right-wing platforms and talking to people like Piers Morgan.
That'd make one of us.
But when you go on BBC, it's always this, is racism real? Does racism, what's your experience? And and they close the debate. So it's not really a debate. It's just a nonsense conversation. It doesn't have you can't say anything if you say anything too contrary, they'll shut it down straight away. And they're just not, there's nothing. That's pointless. Honestly, that is, we're not going anywhere. At least if you go on Piers Morgan is right wing, you can throw anything you like out there. They want spectacle, which means you can really put out some really, we need ideas which disturb people, right? So when I went on with Piers Morgan and said the British Empire is worse than the Nazis, and he was like, oh, shocked, and he was like, but that's the kind of discussion we need to have, not does racism exist? That's a nonsense. That's a dead end. Let's talk about whether the British Empire is worse than the Nazis. That's a productive conversation, which you can actually have, strangely enough.
But do you
more
think
with the racists.
Do you think that you do have like an actual discussion with them about that, or do you think, because I have come to the conclusion that those platforms they're entertainment more than anything else, right? I call it the circus, and I don't know that anyone walks away from those discussions with views different to those that they held prior. And I'm also extremely conscious, especially these days, of stepping into spaces where the power structures, all power structures are skewed towards the global majority in all spaces, pretty much, unless you're creating them yourself. But stepping into those spaces, you're already having to dig yourself up from minus 15 underground before you can even start talking. Do you know what I mean? You're not starting at ground zero. You're having to dig up all of this stuff that they already believe that you're like should be paid to help them unpick before you can actually start the conversation, if you even get to have the conversation.
I guess the thing is who you're trying to convince.
That's the question.
For me, when I go having those, it's not like with Piers, okay, forget that. But there's a whole secondary audience, people online will pick it up. I remember before, when I wrote for The Guardian on BBC, they would never let me say Psychosis or Whiteness. It would always get edited out. It would always get, no, you can't do this, you can't do this.
Really?
Always. When I went on with Piers, they had a whole section on it. What's a psychosis? What does this mean? And then from that, I had so many conversations about psychosis, and there's this whole, on the show is whatever, but there's a whole productive second life of those conversations you just can't have on the left. In fact, part of the reason I wrote the book is so that The Guardian had to put it in The Guardian, and then I had to get invited on BBC and say Psychosis or Whiteness. But it needed a book behind it before they'd accept it.
Yeah.
So I think we can use those platforms to get the things we want if we know what we're looking for. Right? You're not looking to have a debate with Piers Morgan. You're looking to spark that, have a clip, share it on social, and then have a discussion with the actual people that matter, right?
Okay, yeah, I suppose as a strategic move, I can see the value. Although I still have to say, I feel like the white man gets paid off for all of that. They
get paid anyway, though, they all get paid in it. So use the platform to boost yourself. I say most people know me from talking to Piers Morgan. So so use the platform to get what you need, right?
And what about the word whiteness itself? Because I know that I'm aware that it's controversial when I say the word whiteness. I get a lot of pushback. I get pushback even when I describe Piers Morgan as a white man, which is what he is, both in terms of his ethnicity, but also in terms of his outlook. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, for people who are listening who might be like, well, I find it offensive. I would not want to refer to somebody according to their skin color. Why are you referring to me according to my skin color?
Would you prefer white devil? I mean, that's what I'd probably say. No, I mean...
Kehinde.
I think...
Fair, fair.
What do you want to say? It's a reality, right?
Whenever I've had people say to me, the nation, they call people white devils, and I'm like, fair. Accurate. What do you want me to say?
What can you say?
Look at the history. It's a difficult one to unpick.
It is. In fact, so in this Malcolm X book I'm writing, there's a chapter called You Wicked Race of Devils, right? Because I want to deal with that, because there's a reason why people are so critical of whiteness and white people, because historically it's really bad, and contemporarily it's really bad too, right? But I think the distinction of I always say the distinction of whiteness and white people is important. So whiteness is a set of ideas, it's an ideology, it's a way of going through the world.
Yeah.
The black people and brown people are just as culpable in, right? Psychosis of whiteness is not just for those with white skin at all. In fact, you could probably argue we may be more susceptible to it in total. But no, I think if one of the big delusions is this idea that white people, that whiteness is invisible, right? We don't talk about it. Well,
neutral.
Ethnicity is just black and brown people, right? Like you don't have ethnicity, like you don't have race. Of course you do.
Yeah.
Whiteness is the key framing thing in the world. In fact, when I go to do talks at schools, I always show a map of the world by GDP per capita, so the amount of money in the country, but divided by the amount of people, which is the real measure of wealth and poverty. And what you find really obvious, the kids always pick it out. Darkest parts, where the poorest parts, where the black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow.
Richest parts of the West, where the white people live, and there's this hierarchy in between. We literally have a world of white supremacy today. Don't tell me you can't talk about whiteness. That's nonsense.
Well, it's interesting because I do think that part of it is a resistance to having to integrate negative self-perception, which none of us like to do, right? I mean, it's partly why people don't want to go to therapy, because you're going to have to hear things about yourself that you don't want to hear. And I remember reading Bell Hook's Whiteness in the Black Imagination, which, describes the way in which white people often assume that they are perceived, or that we are perceived as neutral by black people, because we perceive ourselves as neutral. And so this flipping of the way, the one who looks, because it's always white people looking at black people, it's never black people looking at white people, or brown people looking at white people, projects an understanding of white people as a group that is, one tied up with fear and violence and anger and impunity. And that's a reflection that we don't want to face, because it's an ugly reflection. And it's not an easy one to integrate, but it's part of it. Do you think that there's like a subconscious, I mean, I know this might even be falling into like making excuses for it, but sometimes I think, is it like a subconscious thing that people don't want to confront that history and all that then flows from it, right? Imagine you acknowledge it, like, oh God, we were. we did do a few things, like maybe we do need to,
No, it is, it's not on purpose. Again, also with psychosis, why I like the idea is psychosis is not something you necessarily choose, right?
Yeah.
But it's something that's important to in that mental health case, it's important to hide, mask whatever illness you have, right?
Yeah.
And so that, if white people had to honestly look and say, well, actually, how did we get this wealth? How are we here? What's happening to the world?
Yeah.
It does. It's completely dissonance, right? So that's the purpose of the psychosis, to keep us deluded. That's not really an excuse, right? You have to change, you have to think, but again, thinking about where we go forward and how do we change things, I always say there's no point. You're not going to convince white people to change. That's not going to be the way that this happens. You have to deal with the actual problem, which is the political and economic system. And you can do that without white. Like you can have a revolution without white people. They'll come along eventually. That the revolution is what ends white. It's the psychosis, not the other way around. Right?
But for the revolution, do you not need as many people on board as possible?
I mean, you need. Well, I mean, I'm a black radical, right? So I mean, I believe in the black revolution. And hey, if anybody who wants to help can help, but we cannot rely on white people or anyone else, right? We have to rely on ourselves.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll be stuck in the same hamster wheel forever.
And the black radical tradition is based, I mean, that answer is also based on the idea that there have been previous attempts to reach out and create coalitions with other like white working class groups and stuff that haven't quite led to the outcomes that the black radical tradition would have hoped for. Would that be fair?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, black radical tradition is a big term. It covers a lot of things. Black Marxists in particular have always held on to the idea that, white working class will come along.
Yeah.
It's never materialized, but to be honest, black people coming along it's never materialized either. But there is a radical argument that says, look, if you unite Africa and you unite the diaspora, that is enough to tip the scales. If Africa is free, capitalism can't work. And therefore, then you have to have a different conversation, right? And that's when you start to build real solidarity and real coalition.
So let's talk a little bit about Africa being free, because obviously the last few years we have seen some very interesting developments in the global south more generally, but also specifically in Africa. And I wanted to ask you about, for example, the elections in Senegal, which saw a Pan-African new president come to power, who'd obviously previously been in prison. Do we think that there is the emergence of a new, a new set of elites coming out of Africa who are representing hope for the revolution you aspire to? Some of them are coming to power through coups, some of them through elections.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to have no hope. I don't, but I will say, I'll say this. The version of Pan-Africanism which relies on these elites to lead it is the one that's a dead end. It's not going to work. I promise you it won't work. Even think about elections. What's the problem? What did I say before the problem was? It's countries themselves, right? So even the problem with Pan-Africanism in the 60s, and one of the reasons why I don't necessarily use the term Pan-Africanism is there is this version of Pan-Africanism which is very nation-state centered, non-interference with different places. Everybody gets kind of attached to their country a bit too much.
Yeah.
There isn't the cooperation that you really need, and it ends up just selling out eventually to the West. And so I'm not sure that's not what's happening at the moment, but it's certainly better than what it was. So let's say this is a good thing that we're having. French West Africa, Burkina Faso. There's things happening, and hopefully it's positive. I'm not going to say it's not positive, but you have to have grassroots up, and I haven't really seen it. We have a coup. That's not really the case. You have a former leader. That's not really the case. Are we actually building the grassroots mechanisms across the African continent, which can really hold people accountable? That's when you get actual freedom, and I haven't seen that yet.
And I suppose a lot of people would say the reason is because a lot of those countries continue to operate on a sort of neo-colonial model where Western powers continue to interfere significantly in their politics and in their day-to-day running, and particularly anything to do with trade. I wanted to ask you, therefore, about, in the case of Senegal specifically, so Bassirou Diomaye Faye, who is Senegal's youngest president, he, has been pledging systemic change, greater sovereignty, and his first state visit was to China.
Okay.
I guess there'll be some revolutionary figures on the continent who might regard China as an ally in countering Western imperialism, but others may not be quite as hopeful given some of China's actions in Africa. Can you give us a sense of what you think of China's role in Africa today?
Yeah, well, I think it's we have to understand that the revolutionary China, Chairman Mao's China, is not the China today. When African countries were going through, places like Guinea-Bissau, places like Angola, getting support from China, that was revolutionary support, right? Very clearly, we want to topple the West. It's revolutionary moment, and China plays off that immensely. Like China plays off Mao immensely anyway. But since Mao died, this is a different China. It is communist China. China's wealth and rise has been predicated on embracing white supremacy, right? They go into Africa and they're exploiting these resources. I mean, China is actually exploiting resources worse than Europe. I mean, some of these deals are insane when you think, what are they actually taking away and extracting?
I think there's a little bit of a rose-tinted view sometimes of China, which I do understand as a counterweight to US imperialism. But in terms of some of the actual policies that we've seen, the types of debts that they've been creating, the purchasing of key infrastructures, mines, ports, some would regard that as its own form of colonialism.
Because Africa was underdeveloped, it doesn't have the resources to mine its own things, right? It's still, most of the countries are deeply poor, so they can't do it. They don't want to go with the West. The West are terrible. The West has the IMF and the World Bank who just make everything worse and attach to all these conditions. Whereas China will come in and say, well, look, we want do what you like. We don't really care. We won't interfere in your politics. We just want your ports. We want your mines. We'll give you this money, right?
Yeah.
And it's just as bad. It's just the same pact, right? And what you see China's done, China's become the workshop of the world. They're taking that resources out for nothing. They're then selling them back and packaging them back to Africa. I think one in Nigeria, for example, when China got involved in the textile market, they completely collapsed Nigerian textiles. This is exactly what the West has done. Like it's just not different. Like, and I think part of this psychosis is that because they're not white, we assume they're better. They're not better. In fact, China may be worse. In the long run, I'm not even sure China's not worse. And they'll build stadiums, and in fact, we're having a convention in Gambia in 2026 where we're trying to bring together convention African people. We're trying to bring together as many people in the diaspora and continent as possible, and it's in a really nice purpose-built convention center made by the Chinese. Obviously, every convention center you want to go to in Africa made by the Chinese. These white elephant projects, which aren't really about development for people, they just make it look good. Their prestige. Honestly, China's. We have to accept that China is what Malcolm would call a fox. The West is the wolf, snarling teeth. You know it's racist. You know they want to eat you. China's coming in smiling. They bare their teeth in a smile. We're still in a doghouse.
And what about these emergence of these new kind of organizations in the global south? I mean, what are your thoughts about the BRICS, Brazil and Russia and China, India and Senegal, and now others who've joined on the
Nigeria
idea of,
recently.
Absolutely, who are sort of positing themselves as a sort of counterweight, right, to the empire, the US empire, and I guess to the Chinese empire to some extent by providing a block as opposed to sort of relying on them exclusively. What do you hold out any hope for BRICS?
I have to say with the BRICS, I actually don't. I think China's involvement is and not China, India, Russia, your friend? Like, Russia's not your friend. Come on. I think if those three countries in particular have real clear neo-colonial policies and ambitions, and the countries are being pulled up on white supremacy, right? You need to have people in poverty. So if it's involved China, and Russia, I can't see it's that positive. And also going back historically, This isn't really new. So the Bandung Conference in '55, which we all grew up like romanticizing these things. When you actually read about it, it wasn't what we think at all.
Oh,
right?
no, don't tell me this, because I totally romanticize this. This is the third way. This is neither east nor west. This was, for people who aren't familiar with this, give us a little summary.
So Bandung brought together, it was 55, and it brought together like, it was the idea of the idea of the third world. It's not east, it's not west. You have Asian countries, African countries. A lot of the Pan-African leaders were there as well.
Yeah.
But it also had the reactionaries were there too, right? So the American client states basically had a whole agenda to subvert anything revolutionary. So anytime they criticized the West, there was some pro-Western stuff. And so America was terrified of it at first. But then when it actually happened, they were like, it's all right. Nothing changed. It's fine. We're still in control. And I do worry that this is what you're going to get with the BRICS, particularly because actually where we're headed is China is rising, but China's not rising as something separate to the West. China's just taking over the West, right? If you think about the way the New Age of Empire works, America took over from Europe, and it's likely that China's going to take over from America. But the features are still the same. It's still the same thing. And just because China's not white, we think it's different, but actually the logic of it is still exactly the same.
And that's the logic of capitalism, presumably. Yeah. Even though obviously this is the maddest thing that we continue to refer to China as a communist country. I mean, can you explain this for people who might be confused? Because I myself am confused by it. So is China actually a communist country?
No, not at all. China's not a communist country. It's a version of social democracy, right? But there's massive wealth. So communist countries don't have massive wealth in them, right? The idea of communism is that it's all shared ownership, and that you just wouldn't have these extremes, right? And even you think about the way that the economy works, how has China become rich? China's become rich because it's the base point now, really, of capitalist production, right? Where do they sell their goods to? America, Oz. Around the world. They need those markets. China needs America to be rich. If America gets poor, China is also poor, right? They're actually together. We think they're different. They're not different at all. And in terms of Africa, you can see really clearly what China has done. So China joins the World Trade Organization, one of the most capitalist organization around open economy and accepting all the rules of trade, which China would not have done ever in a million years with Mao, when it was actually a communist country. And it's only since it joined the World Trade Organization that it started to invest is the wrong word, to leech from Africa, where it literally has gone from zero investment at all to massive amounts of investment on the World Trade Organization, rules which are capitalist rules, which allow them to completely and utterly exploit the economy. So no, China is not communist internally, and globally is definitely not communist. It is the foundation stone now of the capitalist economy.
And it's worth saying that it's not just in Africa, it's also done the same across Asia, right? Oh God, is it from the frying pan into the fire, Kehinde? Like, I just feel like, every time there seems to be some aspiration for hope, it's like, well, don't worry, the US empire is crumbling. There'll be an alternative, China.
No, so actually for Psychosis, the craziest thing I actually read to that whole book was China, which is really interesting that China actually, it models itself on America economically, and consumption patterns. Like, look at the things that McDonald's open, Starbucks, all these things open. It's just like a facsimile of America. And one of the things that was the most craziest I read was in the Olympics. So it was 84. One of the Olympics, they watched the Olympics and Americans are doing really well, and they're like, "Oh, we need to be new China man, like the Americans. We're too small. We're not big enough. We need to be like Americans." And they basically say this is because they drink milk, and we don't drink milk. Okay. And most of the world is lactose intolerant, right? Most of the world is lactose intolerant. Chinese people are lactose intolerant, so they don't drink milk. So they go and do some research and work out that all kids can drink milk, and if you keep milk in the diet, you basically can get over lactose intolerance. And so they have this program to make Chinese people non-lactose intolerant so they can drink milk and become like Americans. And so now China's one of the biggest milk consuming countries because they want to be like America.
No,
it's bad, right?
And now Americans are all drinking oat milk anyway. What is going on?
And it's destroying the world because all these cows they need to produce this milk is bloody causing the climate crisis.
I
mean, if there's anything more symbolic, I don't know what else. And milk's even white, right? Like, we're literally talking about white supremacy.
Literally drinking.
Change your whole population's dietary habits so you can be like.
So you can imitate. Man. This summer we had the riots across the UK, in which Black and brown communities were targeted very overtly in racist violence. Yeah. Would you say that those riots were a symptom of structural racism then, or and you wouldn't recognize that some of those individuals should be termed racist, or how would you describe those riots then?
They were racist riots, but the worst way to think about it is that they were racist people who caused the racist riots.
Okay.
So how do we deal with that problem of those riots? Those are clearly about structural racism, right? The lies that are being told by politicians, media, et cetera, about black and brown people, right? The economic things which are happening, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the targeting. Clearly, obviously they're racist. That's a racist act.
Yeah.
But what we do is we say, well, look, that's because these uneducated white people, look, what do they don't know? We've just blamed them, put them in prison. That did not solve the problem. They are not actually the problem. That's a symptom. The fact that they're going out there, the individuals are a symptom of the structure, right? So if you think you can fix that problem by arresting people, that's the worst idea. That's not the problem. What caused it was the structure. What caused it was the politicians. That's the racism. That's what I'm trying to say. Those people out there, they're individually prejudiced. It's problematic. I'm not saying you shouldn't treat it.
Yeah.
But what we basically we've conflated actual racism with individual prejudice. There are individually prejudiced people out there.
Yeah.
And everything that we've done about racism is how do you stop those individually prejudiced people?
I actually think that sometimes the word racism has just become, at least in some people's ears, a byword for bad person. Mm-hmm. And so they don't really understand what we mean. You're just saying I'm a bad person. You're just saying I'm evil. I'm not evil. I'm a good person. Okay, cool. You might be a good person, but that, at least when I'm using the word racism personally, I'm talking about participation in structures that continue to reinforce or maintain inequality within our society along the lines of race, right? The people who are devising these policies, are they not themselves also racists? I mean, I'm looking at, the other day I was reading an article about the founder of PayPal, who is, I mean, he is an overt racist. This man, you know, grew up in South Africa. You know, he's German. He grew up with like a nostalgia for, born in Germany, raised in South Africa. Elon was raised in South Africa. These white people who have a history of nostalgia or compassion or empathy for Nazism and Aryan ideologies, some of them are actually in very significant positions of power.
Yeah, 100%. I think that the Elon Musk thing is crazy. You're surprised the white South Africa does a Hitler salute? You haven't been to South Africa.
I have not.
That's the least surprising thing ever. So I guess the reason I'd say, are they racist? They're definitely prejudiced people, 100%.
Yeah.
And you could say, Elon Musk is a racist. He's clearly a racist, does racist things. The reason I just don't know how useful it is, because then you have people who clearly aren't prejudiced racist. They'll do the same thing.
Yes.
Right? So
there's participants in the same system.
They'll still participate. So for me, it's about what is you actually participating in. Keir Starmer, for example, I don't think Keir Starmer doesn't like black people, but I know he'll do policies that don't support black people.
Yeah.
Because that's how it is. So I think when we say this label of racist, I don't think it's helpful because it conflates it way too much with individuals, also with white people.
Yeah.
Right? So then if I'm saying, well, Suella Braverman, she's clearly would clearly fit into the she's a racist category, but it don't work because she's brown, right? So I just don't think it's a useful dialogue to say there's racism, not racist.
Okay.
There's racism, there's structures of racism, or you participate in them, you don't participate, or you don't, right?
Yeah.
If we thought of it on that level, we just do better things, I think.
And so, just out of interest, would you say that you distinguish between racism and prejudice, right?
Yeah.
And so prejudice being kind of nasty words and opinions that have no material impact on your life, and then racism is something that structurally disadvantages.
So actually go back to that example. Like, clearly Elon Musk is prejudiced. He can do racist things though because there's a system of racism. Right? All these people can only do these things because there are systems of racism. And the one thing you cannot get rid of is individual prejudice.
Yeah.
Like, there's always going to be individually prejudice. I might not like people. I've had my own prejudice, whatever.
Yeah.
But my prejudice is I can't go out and act. If I start going around running around calling people white devils, I'll end up in prison, right? So even in those instances where you have these racist prejudice, they can only do these big things because the structure of racism allows them to do it, right?
And I mean, look, I think there'll be a lot of people also looking at the show thinking, well, we've had a massive pushback against racism. We had the BLM protests across the world in which, you know, thousands of people took to the streets, to protest police brutality. Isn't that a sign that actually we as a society are less and less tolerant of racism?
No, we're less and less tolerant of prejudice. This is the whole problem, right? If you think of BLM, what happened? It was all about prejudice, even in the police issue, which is a structural issue, not a individual police officer. It all becomes about how do you stop individual police, how do you train the police, how do you do this how do you get more black police officers? Doesn't deal with the problem. All the legal framework that we've had, all the civil rights gains that we've had are about prejudice. They're actually about prejudice, not racism, right? And that's been the problem. That's why nothing changes because actually there's a structural issue of the role of black and brown people in society, which is also not just in Britain. You can't just solve that problem in Britain. It is a much bigger problem. I mean, and we should know this as Britain, empire. I mean, one of the biggest problems in the way Britain thinks about itself is a nation state. When it's not a nation state, it's an empire with the largest empire that ever existed. So how do we think we can understand racism nationally? It's beyond me completely. But yeah, the problem is we focused on prejudice and we actually haven't tackled racism at all in any meaningful way.
And of course, I was reading that more people have died, black people have died at the hands of the police after the BLM protests than prior to that, exactly. Which, obviously supports your point. I want to ask you about these liberation models that we are kind of having to consider given the juncture that we're at. I think a lot of people are feeling that mainstream politics is no longer offering avenues for the deep forms of social change social and political change that are required to achieve the ideals that even we as a society uphold as being ours, right? Yeah. And in that context, I want to ask you about what those models of liberation look like. Can we rid the system of structural racism through formal political routes?
Formal political routes? No, right? They're just not set up to do it, right? We have to understand that the system isn't failing, it's actually working, right? When black people die disproportionately, that's the point. That's what it's supposed to do, right? So every time we see this and go, okay, well, this is a problem. It's not a problem. That's what the system does every day. So the only way to get rid of that is to create a new system. This is why we need revolutionary politics. Give up on this thing. It's not going to work. That's why I said, don't go be British. Give up on it, right? We need to create different things. And I think the biggest trick that is pulled on us is to believe that there is no alternative, right? Like when Malcolm was alive 60 years ago, when he said revolution, everybody thought, yeah, maybe, right? You had Commons Revolution, Pan-African Revolution, there's loads of revolutions. And what happened was they killed loads of people, like Malcolm. But the bigger problem is they actually incorporated enough of us in that we thought everything was better. Right? And so now we don't think there's an alternative. So there are alternative models, but those models are saying, look, we need revolution, we need something else. That's what black radical politics is about. Saying actually, look, liberate Africa, create something new. That's actually the solution. None of these other things can ever give us freedom.
Are you saying that Beyonce winning a record number of Grammys is not a win for black liberation, Kehinde?
It's probably a loss, if I'm honest, because you get these tokens put up there and it's actually worse. It's worse than that. And I'm one of the problems, I'll be honest. Me as a professor is one of the problems. 50, 20 years, actually it's pretty unlikely now that I'm professor, right? Only 160 black professors in the whole country. We can't all get a plane together just in case it crashes. Then there'll be none of us left, right? That's how few of us there are. So it's pretty unlikely now, but then you make it into these positions and then you get held up as, oh, well, look, you can do it too. I promise you, if you're watching this saying, using me as a role model for being a black professor, you have more chance of dying in the next 20 minutes probably than getting into my position. That's the unfortunate reality that we live in.
That's actually nuts. That's actually nuts. I wanted to ask you about these transnational models of liberation because I also am a believer in transnational models of liberation and solidarity. And obviously Malcolm X was a reference both for the black community and the Muslim community. Yes. And I wanted to ask you where you see those models of transnational liberation today, because of course, Malcolm X would go to Algeria, he would go to Ghana, he would travel to places to create connections between grassroots liberation movements and create those connections and forms of solidarity. In order to create a sort of, a counterweight, an alternative power base.
I think Palestine is a perfect example of where you can see this, right? There's been massive support across black and brown support on this because obviously we can see what's happening, right? Like we can see that what's happening in Palestine is the classic settler colonial playbook. We know this. We know what's going to, and so Palestine is a black issue, always has been a black issue because of that. And then that solidarity, I think, has shown through quite strongly, I think. It doesn't always shine through, but I think the biggest problem is actually we get stuck in the nation state, right? We start to think about, competing for resources between each other, which is completely problematic, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's where you find most of the problems. How do we compete? Because we live together, right? We live connected together, and then we're always competing with each other.
That's the main one I keep hearing, right? Is like, I've had to fight so hard. So this is from some of my black friends who've done very well, who maybe have not spoken out on Palestine. And he'll say things like, we have fought so hard to get into these positions that we can't take these risks where we are today. Other people can ask other people, but don't ask us, because we've had to fight harder than everybody else to be where we are today. And it's easier to get rid of us than it is to get rid of anybody else. And that bit I agree with. I do think if anyone's going to easily get dropped off, flicked off the board, it will be the newly arrived black elites, for sure.
100%.
But I do think that, that sort of speaks to your point about the ways in which buying into the system, stops us from being able to recognize those forms of solidarity that bind us towards a kind of greater goal of liberation. Where does Palestine fit into the black liberation movement?
Well, as I understand it, and I think this is the example you give is really the problem of getting into the house, right? When you're in the house, that's the house Negro mentality, right? You can't rock the boat. You got to be within it. You got to, and that's the bigger problem, right? And that's why we expect too much from people in that position. We might people expecting David Lammy to be pro-Palestine. I mean, come on.
He's in Tottenham. Come on. Kehinde, we had hopes.
The man came on radio and said he was English. Once he said that was enough for me.
Yeah.
I don't need to hear anything else. Right? The Foreign Secretary of the UK is not going to be pro-Palestine. I think we just have to admit that's what it is to be in the house, right? And so the question was where does Palestine fit in the black radical tradition?
Yeah.
Always. I mean, I only care about Palestine because of I read Malcolm, I read Pan-Africans, I read the Black Panther Party. You don't even like that. When you understand the world through that lens, you understand what white supremacy is. You understand the playbook of it. You understand very, 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 very clearly that what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. Called that genocide for decades. And to be honest, the only reason the genocide isn't complete is because of media.
There is also a huge trend now for black capitalism. I'm surrounded by friends who have drunk the black capitalism Kool-Aid, and I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on black capitalism as the road for emancipation for black minorities in the West.
No, the capitalism is racism. So being a black capitalist means you're a racist, if you're all racism. It's participating in a racist system. I think that's actually one of the problems with terms like black power. They can mean anything. Honestly, you could use black power for Malcolm. You could use black power for Clarence Thomas. Clearly Badenoch might even think she's doing black power. I don't know. Right? So
she might.
She really
literally
might, right?
People might be telling her you are winning as a black woman right now. I'm not joking. There's probably a few people saying that.
Oh no, that's so yeah. So I would be specific. We say black radicalism. That's very specific. That is not capitalism. That is not black capitalism. That's building alternatives, right? That's you pooling our resources, not so that we can have lots of businesses, but pooling our resources so that we can have a different economy, right? Creating. I mean, the long range program for black radicalism is essentially the unification of Africa, and Africa is for now, and this is the thing people really like, the mineral wealth is only until the minerals have gone. At some point there won't be any mineral wealth, and then Africa is really, really, really poor, right?
Yeah.
So the goal for black radical politics is always unify Africa. Africa has enough resources, farmland to take itself completely out of the world system. Only place in the world that can really do this. And if you did that, capitalism is over. It literally ends the next day. Yeah. And so that's the goal that's the radical vision for black power.
And how hopeful are you at the prospect of being able to unify the continent, given how many, there have been many attempts, many proposals. What do you see as the main barrier to the unification of, I guess, black people across the world, right? Not just across Africa.
Ironically, it's psychosis of whiteness. It really is. We bought into that psychosis of whiteness, that delusion. Think about all the things you say about education system and media. They are just as prevalent on the African continent or around the world as there are. So we believe that the West is best. We believe in black capitalism. We'll get together and have, we'll do things which are just bad things. The African Union is a perfect example of Pan-Africanism gone wrong, right? Completely capitulates to the West and now to China. African leaders will literally, they'll have summits with Europe, summits with America, summits with China. They won't invite anybody. They have to go chase around the world to each place together, all of them. It's embarrassing, honestly. Don't get me started. So and it's becoming worse, right? And actually, you think about migration, what people have realized that the African continent, it's not producing for them. So what do? They flee here. That's making it worse, right? Because that's making it even worse. So there's so many impediments to it, but you still have to be positive, right? You still have to believe, because the conditions of revolution will always be there.
I guess you're saying that minorities in general should be doing the opposite of what we're being told to do in Western societies, which is to integrate, right? There's a big focus on integration and even assimilation as the way in which minorities should behave in majority settings in the West. And you're saying the opposite to that, right? You're saying don't integrate, don't assimilate, hold on to what indigenous or heritage cultures and ideals.
Yeah.
And always have the kind of ancestral land as your reference point.
Yeah, what's the point of what we're doing? Malcolm said a better word than separation is independence. So if you live in the UK, you got to get a job, you got to do things, fair enough. But the goal should be, how are we actually building the alternative? That should be the goal. So even me, professor, etc., the goal should be, how can I use my platform, my resources to build the alternative? And that's what we're trying to do. Harambee Organization of Black Unity is all about that. Let's build the alternative. We're here, you can't not be here. I'm not saying don't get a good job, whatever, do what you need to do to eat. But long-term planning, long-term thinking should be, how are we actually building the alternative? Because otherwise we'll just be stuck in this until it ends. And that's the other thing, this is going to end. Capitalism is going to collapse at some point. Maybe sooner than we think.
Okay.
But you got the climate crisis, it's killed the whole planet. Like the idea this is going to go on forever that's a big delusion in itself.
Yeah.
So it's not even just a case of you should do this because it's the moral thing to do.
Yeah.
It needs to be done. The system, all empires crumble, and when this empire crumbles, Black people will be even worse off if we don't do something else about it, right?
But so in that sense, does what you advocate for overlap weirdly with what some of these racists are saying, that basically go back to your country? You're like, yes, please.
Hey, give me the plane to go. God. No, in a funny, it's actually ironic because in the Garvey movement, Universal Negro Improvement Association, had the Back to Africa thing. And some of the people this is why Garvey dealt with KKK. They had these racist Southern Republicans were like, yeah, we'll sponsor a bill to kick you out because it did kind of overlap with that. The problem is that Garvey had actually, and the problem with that idea is it's not just about going back, right? Like I could just go back, but like Jamaica, actually I had this on Piers Morgan said, why don't you leave the country? Why don't you go? And I'm like, well, what country am I going to? Because Jamaica, where I'm from, is probably more white supremacy than it is here. Ghana, Nigeria, any place in Africa I might hail from is more white supremacy than it is here.
Yeah.
So it's not just about going back, it's about actually fixing the problem. And that is not what they want, right? That is not, you're not going to get support from white supremacists to fix the problem.
I want to ask you as a final question, as somebody who's a big fan of Malcolm X, that's something we both share. And I know that your next book is going to be about him. If Malcolm were alive today, God rest his soul, what would he be saying to us all? Like, what would he be advocating for?
Well, firstly, he'd say, I told you so. Like, honestly, so the book, Nobody Can Give You Freedom, I listened to all the Malcolm X speeches, interviews, and was like, wow, this is a clear theory. Like, proper, like, lays it all out, tells you about white supremacy, tells you about the problem, and gives you a solution, right? And Malcolm said, look, if we follow the civil rights path, token integration, what he calls it, we're going to end up exactly where we've ended up. It's like a prophet. Like you listen to Malcolm in the 60s, like this is what's going to happen. And this is where we are. So there'd be a big, I told you so. It'd also be very angry, I think, because we do have access to more stuff now. Like the idea of unity is so much easier now. Like internet, all these things which are kind of terrible also kind of connect us together in a way. And we're just not doing it, right? Malcolm had to get on a plane for like travel. It was so hard to travel around the continent. And what we do, we're having diaspora wars. So Malcolm would also be cussing a lot of people. And I've cussed some of those people in the book. So
I'm aware, and I'm aware that there was a bit of a backlash. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because a lot of people. But the big thing he'd be saying is, look, the goal is still the same. Malcolm died, he started the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and it was to unite all Afro-Americans. And in the perfect idea of what Malcolm means, when he said Afro-American, he says, I mean anybody in South America, anybody in the Caribbean, anybody in Canada, anybody in the Western Hemisphere is Afro-American. We're all Black people. We need to unite, and then you unite together with those people in the African continent, and you create an organizational alternative. So his vision was basically to build the OAU into an organization that subverted nation state, had we all membered in, we all paid our taxes into, had departments, and we ran our own thing. And he left the blueprint for that in 1964. We all ignored it. So we'd be like, what happened? He's like, I told you what to do. Why no one do it? So I think he'd be mad on that sense, but he'd still be pushing the same agenda. That's the solution for black people anyway. That's the black radical solution. How do we build an organization with all of us in it collectively where we can determine our future and go forward? And that's what Malcolm will be pushing for.
Kehinde, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. At The Tea, we are passionate about bringing you unique and meaningful discussions that aren't always in the spotlight. If you believe in what we're doing, we'd love your support. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on Patreon. Your support keeps us independent and helps us keep these important conversations alive. Until next time, stay awake, support independent content, and we'll see you soon for more tea.